or like autonomous indigenous cyberpunk, where it imagines a future where indigenous people can cohabit with like technologies that we make ourselves without, corporations being involved. All the minerals that are in South America, for example, all the mines that exist there,
Hmm.
if indigenous people weren't colonized, I'm sure that, even back before we were colonized, we were still using those minerals and all those mines to develop tools. And I'm sure that, had it not been for colonialism, we would have gone on a trajectory to, develop, more iterations and more tools based off those like resources that we live with. Giant mechs are like those giant mechs are supposed to be made of like minerals that are found in South America. So there's these huge beasts that, were autonomously made with with like indigenous resources
Hmm.
rather than, like through exploitation or anything like that. The coexistence between like technology and nature and how like indigenous people have been doing that for basically thousands of years.
Anyways, hey everybody, I'm Silver Spook. This is the um, Silver Spook stream, but we will be uploading this later. But I'm very happy to talk today to, uh, Santo Aveiro-Ojeda. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. Don't worry about it too much. But yeah, I'm really happy to like be on this call because I feel like recently, I don't know, I feel like Cyberpunk has been on my mind a lot. But yes, hi, I'm Santo, and I go on Twitter by the name Babigoth. My family's Indigenous Guarani, and I myself make games based around like Guarani beliefs and spirituality. And my latest game was Don't Wake the Night, which came out last year. But I'm currently working on more like Indigenous cyberpunk related projects. And most recently, I did residency with Imaginative, which is the International Indigenous Film Festival. I did a residency exploring, what Indigenous cyberpunk means and, what are some examples of it. So it's definitely been more on my mind lately. And, what is exactly, not just cyberpunk, but just what is Indigenous cyberpunk in particular, because I believe that it's something like very specifically and categorically different. Um, but yeah, I feel that it's something that has been, emerging more, especially as people think about, indigenous sovereignty and its relation to like the digital age and technology. But yeah, how has previous talks on here been for you?
Yeah, they've been going very well. I mean, obviously, because CD Projekt Red Cyberpunk 2077 has, just made a huge splash.
Mhm.
I was anticipating this. I mean, most people on here know who I am. I'm Silver Spook, Native Hawaiian. The shirt I'm wearing is, Kuki Aimauna is action that we were participating in against the desecration of our sacred mountain here on the Big Island of Hawaii, where I'm from. And so,
Mhm.
being a Native Hawaiian is always, you know, I'm definitely an indigenous cyberpunk creator, and I identify with a lot of cyberpunk historic like in the past because
Mhm.
of kind of like I identify with the low life in the high tech low life. I'm like, yeah, I'm from a ghetto. I'm from a very impoverished kind of area where the life expectancy is like 30 years shorter than the average American. And so
Mhm.
it's, you don't think about Hawaii, you think about that. You think of fun and sun, but anyway, I'm not gonna go on a rant because that's not what this is about. But not yet, anyway. But I think that it's really like, I was trying to contact a lot of other indigenous creators. I mean, Neophyte is my game. Obviously, it's a game about my life experiences that's, reflected
Mhm.
through cyberpunk, but my kind of take on it. And so I wanted to talk to a lot of other cyberpunk like Umurangi Generation's creator. Uh,
Mhm.
I
Mhm.
know them as at best. I think they go by sometimes Tali, or Naftali.
Mhm. Mhm.
But yeah, I was talking to Veselikov and also to Tim from Conquest of
Mhm.
Dread, who is another. They're
Oh
both
yeah, yeah,
Maori
yeah.
from Aotearoa or New Zealand, and so that was a kind of Pacific indigenous cyberpunk talk, which was it was very I like that. That was very it was very what do you call it? It was very validating because we can all say we're not just shouting at a wall of upset
Yeah,
gamers. You know, it's like we kind of like we all get it. You know, and so that's always anyway.
absolutely. Yeah,
So yeah, so it's been
yeah.
very good to kind of like talk about those things with the other. I had a few other talks with the creator of Techno Babylon, which is a kind of cyberpunk adventure game.
Oh
Um,
yeah, I've heard of that one. Yeah.
you've heard of that one? Yeah. So
Mhm.
I like that one a lot. It was a big inspiration behind Neophyte. James is he was born in he's British, but he was like born in Kenya, lived in Rio, Japan. His family is like diplomats, and so it's a very
Mhm.
international game, and it deals with a lot of it deals with a lot of representation of other peoples from a variety of places around the world, and also queer characters. There are trans characters that are
Mhm.
I'm not trans myself, but it's just like from what I understand, it's a much better representation than in some other cyberpunk games. And anyway, so long story short, it's yeah. So it's been a it's kind of it's always a big because cyberpunk is such a it's a very complex kind of complicated term
Yeah,
because of the history.
yeah. Especially with
Yeah,
how it's evolved a lot in the past, like even just in the past couple of years.
yeah,
Um, it's evolved quite a lot. So like, there's different to the point where like now there's like quite a few different branches of cyberpunk.
mm-hmm.
Like there's the cyberpunk, that focuses more on like the city. There's the cyberpunk that focuses more on like, institutions and policing and aspects of like futurism. Like there's definitely different, like a lot of different aspects to it. So yeah, I think it's really important to have those types of conversations. And yeah, I do agree with you that it's very validating to have like these conversations with, also like especially indigenous creators because it's all like obviously like we all come from specific backgrounds in different places, but a lot of our visions tend to overlap a little bit, and I think that it's very like it's almost like there are other people that do understand where we're coming from. And for me particularly, I'm inspired a lot by like um, some people refer to it as like solar punk, but I mostly like that's kind of like my approach to cyberpunk. I don't necessarily call it solar punk myself. I just refer to it as like indigenous futurism, or just like indigenous autonomy or like autonomous indigenous cyberpunk.
Mm-hmm.
Where it imagines a future where indigenous people can, you know, do, cohabit with like technologies that we make ourselves, and that, we can profit off ourselves without, corporations being involved. And in particular, there is one Brazilian artist who I forget their actual name, but they go online by Q1 Ross or like Q1R0Z. And they're a Brazilian artist that does a lot of like kind of indigenous cyberpunk like paintings, specifically of like tribes living in Brazil.
Mm-hmm.
And they do a lot about that, about like, for example, people from the tribes there using like futuristic like weapons or tools that are derived from tools that already exist in those cultures. Like
Mm-hmm.
last night, actually, I was just sitting down, like drawing some concept art that I'm gonna put up on my Patreon and on Twitter later in the week. But just the concept of like, oh, maybe like all the minerals that are in South America, for example, all the mines that exist there,
Mm-hmm.
if indigenous people weren't colonized, I'm sure that, even back before we were colonized, we were still using those minerals and all those mines to develop tools. And I'm sure that, had it not been for colonialism, we would have gone on a trajectory to, develop, more iterations and more tools based off those like resources that we live with. And yeah, last night I was just sitting down doing some concept art about like, oh, what if like, people develop these, machetes with like electricity in them, or that functioned like machetes but were like electric, so they would cut maybe make more like laser cuts.
Oh wow.
Um, and that's kind of also what my concept behind like the giant mechs are. Like those giant mechs are supposed to be made of like minerals that are found in South America. So they are all made of like, you know, all like of materials that are already found there. So that's kind of like the concept behind them is that, you know, there's these huge beasts that, you know, were autonomously made with with like indigenous resources
Mm-hmm.
rather than, you know, like through exploitation or anything like that. Um, and so that kind of like more sustainable, I guess, branch of cyberpunk is what um, really appeals to me. Like just the kind of like the coexistence between like technology and nature and how like indigenous people have been doing that for basically thousands of years. Because this is something that I tend to mention a lot, but when we think about technology, we usually think like of, you know, things that we use in our everyday life, like phones or computers or anything that requires some kind of like electric connection or maybe internet. When in reality, a lot of those things are made with, you know, um, exploited labor or they're made through like you know, very like imperialist tactics. And
Mm-hmm.
um, I feel that like there is technology that exists in the world that is not that, right? So like there's different tools that indigenous people have been using for thousands of years. That's also like technology basically is just something that, you know, they're the tools that we use in our everyday life. And indigenous technology definitely exists. Just because it doesn't require, you know, electricity or all those things doesn't mean that it's not technology. So just like rethinking the meaning of technology and thinking about like what, you know, what is technology, what is sustainable technology, what does that look like, especially for indigenous people who have been using, you know, the same tools for a very long time and they work, right? That's why, for example, like um, there are certain like herbs or even just like ways of like harvesting herbs in South America and like Paraguay, where I come from. And those, you know, those kind of approaches have been used for, you know, thousands of years. Like, and they've been used for thousands of years because it's the thing that works the best and it's the most sustainable. Um, so I think thinking along those lines is also kind of like what influences my perspective on that is that like, well, how can I make something that is about indigenous technology that is kind of true to that history, that,
Mm-hmm.
you know, it's something that is sustainable and also like culturally relevant to that region, which in this case it's like primarily South America, but like generally the drier parts of like the Amazon and like the wetlands.
Oh, I see. Yeah, that's yeah. The topic of like how can we have like an indigenous future with indigenous technology is like such a huge topic, and yeah, I mean it's so true. Like it's a thing that I think about a lot because of I guess kind of this probably dovetails into like I think 1870
Mhm.
Cyberpunk Forever and well a lot of your work. I think I just went back and replayed that game, which is fantastic. You should all go play 1870 colon Cyberpunk Forever. It's like you can play it on itch for free. It's a very good like I call it like kind of like an anti-colonial kind of lens
Mhm.
on Cyberpunk. That is it's not it doesn't take you very long, but you get the you really it really like kind of nails home this experience of like you're trying to survive, but you're like can you survive without being just like basically an asshole to indigenous peoples? It's a
Mhm.
challenge, a real challenge, in the 21st century for much of I would say the Western world.
Mhm.
But and it's so it's very but it does incorporate like indigenous technologies, which is a thing that like even within indigenous communities that I have been in, I mean as a Hawaii is a very specific kind of, they basically built Manhattan on top of us,
Mhm.
and then
Yeah.
turned it into a giant Disneyland theme park. It's a very
Mhm.
unusual, like I have a hard time describing it. It's like if you had like let's say Navajo, you have Sioux or any of the other indigenous peoples in Turtle Island, right? They don't really
Mhm.
like. There's a lot of appropriation for sure, right, in a lot of games, movies, etc. But they don't have an entire resort where Larry Ellison is moved here. Mark Zuckerberg owns 700 acres and kicked us all off of our.
Yeah.
They don't.
Hmm.
And they don't have a huge resort with with billions of dollars of per year just selling that culture and everybody and you forced to kind of
Hmm.
work in it. So that kind of experience, like for my own family, and tying this into like what we're talking about, my Hawaiianness is seen as the opposite of technology. It's the opposite
Hmm.
of roads, cars, phones, and that's what the colonizer uses that against us. Oh, do you want to go back to being Hawaiian?
Hmm.
That's about living in a mud hut, no phone, no car, no road, no flush toilet. Even though the Hawaiian Iolani Palace had the flush toilets before the White House, but
Hmm.
anyways, and also electricity. But that's the
Yeah.
narrative that a lot of even my own Hawaiian family, right? My parents, they're like, we don't want to go back to the way that it
Yeah.
was, And I'm like, no, no, like, even Kalakaua, like one our ali'i, our leader, like was inventing submarines, like before
Hmm.
when 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea wasn't even published. The Hawaiian leadership were like it already had a blueprints that they later were built. They're subaquatic vehicles that function. That was an indigenous technology, incorporating
Hmm.
global human technologies, And so anyway, but but there's definitely a lot of people that are there's a lot of indigenous peoples that are also very like embracing of this. Obviously, I talked to several of them. Obviously, Guarani,
Hmm.
sorry, Umurangi Generations creator, my friend Megan Byrne of Achimo Games. I think
Hmm.
and and they're like, how can we, but who also face this kind of no indigeneity is you have to be like 100% no quote unquote technology living, only with you're very in tune with nature and ecology but you can't progress beyond that. You couldn't possibly use your I don't know
Hmm.
lithium or other resources under your feet
Hmm.
in any other way except you have to stay stone tools. That's all you have, right? And so that kind of keeps you boxed in. I feel like it keeps it's a kind of it's a ideological cultural normative propaganda weapon to keep a lot of the indigenous peoples kind of
Hmm.
boxed into a particular way, and it's also very convenient for the colonizer to continue to consume
Hmm.
a version of their culture. And anyway, so let me tie this back into what your stuff is. So I really think that you need to play 1870 Cyberpunk Forever. Okay, if you're watching this, you must. It's like mandatory. That's your homework. Okay. But anyway, so I don't know what you think about that, but I do feel like yeah, if you want to comment on what I just said, I said a lot.
Yeah, no, I definitely like agree that like especially like specific to, for example, South America, like it's definitely kind of like a propaganda tool to say like, oh, you know, indigenous people are better off now because there's like electricity or like there's, all these tools that they're now like exposed to when a lot of the time they don't even get access to those resources. So for example, in both Brazil and Paraguay, a big issue is hydroelectric dams.
Mm,
Because in order to make them, you have to flood like a big part of the Amazon, right? Generally, it's the Amazon. It could be other piece of land, but generally, it's the Amazon. And obviously, the places that you're flooding, like there's people living there, and those people have to be relocated. And when they're relocated, then they don't have access to, they don't live on their land anymore. Therefore, they don't have access to like the same plants that grow there. They don't have access to the same things that and materials that they use to like, live their everyday life.
mm,
And then of course, like, looking at the hydroelectric dam, like, okay, they flooded a bunch of the jungle and now that electricity, where does that electricity actually go to? And that electricity doesn't go to indigenous people, it just goes to, the big cities, people that live, more urban lives in the sense that like they actually have like actual reliable electricity.
right.
And so those same tools that like are advertised as something good, they're not actually available to indigenous people. And the way that these tools are made is specifically through the exploitation of indigenous land and indigenous people. And that's something that is also what kind of influenced my, like anything that I do related to cyberpunk really, but specifically for my newest project that I have going on that I haven't really officially announced too much of it, but essentially, um, it's in it like there's like, for example, like indigenous mechs, right? These giant mechs, and there's also like a portion where you're out in the desert, and there's also a portion where you visit a town, and all of these are kind of informed by how these like resource exploitation affects indigenous people. And for example, the whole point behind these giant mechs is that in the game, like, your mission is to retrieve a stolen artifact that was taken a long time ago, and
Mm-hmm.
you do that by basically driving your own mech to the site where this artifact was stolen. And the whole point is that like something was taken from you, so like a resource was extracted from you, and now the whole point is to get that back, because without that, then you can't uh you can't live the you can't live like a good life. You can't live the life that your family and your ancestors intended for you to live.
Mm-hmm.
Like in Guarani, there's a concept called Decoapura, which is basically translates to like living the good life. So it's kind of like a concept that, to live a good life, you need your community, but you also need your land. And your land is the thing that, your land and your community are kind of the same thing. Because in your land, that's where your community gathers, but that's also where you get all your materials for, whether it be hunting or making clothes or making all these things that, help you live a good life. So with that in mind, like, I just think about it as like, all those resources like that, a lot of people now enjoy as commodities, like it's all at the expense of, a lot of indigenous people. Um, and especially with like 1870, like the twine that I made, I kind of made that twine like almost on a whim. Like I was playing some games, and I think I was playing like Near, and
Oh
it
yeah.
got me thinking about like just like it got me thinking about like futuristic settings. So I'm like, oh cool, what if I made something that is about like someone going from the city to like the more rural parts of the world and trying to understand like how indigenous technology works.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then, understanding that actually the technology that they currently use, is very exploitative and is colonialist, and them kind of talking to these indigenous people and trying to understand that their technology is like kind of like what uh it kind of like it starts undoing some of that thought within them. Um and I think that about that a lot, because it's a lot about just thinking of technology in a different way, and um especially like especially like thinking of like, and I'm sure that you can relate to this, especially with um more tropical places being exploited for all these resources. Like South America is a huge place for that, because like we have a lot of different types of weathers, but especially in the tropical areas, like they're very very exploited, because you can pretty much grow anything there, and you can um, just cut down all the trees and grow a bunch of farms and grow all these plants that were never grown there in the first place, and just, export those, and you make a bunch of money. Or, even in the less tropical areas, there's a bunch of, minerals and mines, so you can just go and, dig up the mountains, and, governments let other corporations come in and, just dig that up and sell it for profit. So I think, yeah, I think it all basically ties back to, indigenous self-determination when it comes to deciding, what our future should be and how that should be managed.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Yeah, there's a lot of directions to take this, but I think that the it's just speaking of minerals. I mean, this is not specifically about present politics, but I mean, cyberpunk is political, despite what
Mhm.
some people on the some people may want to get the politics out of the games. But I think that
Mhm.
that's I'm definitely if you never played Silver Spoon games, that's one thing I don't mince words about political. No, everything I make is political. It's super political. Um, and I think that we need to just all game creators It's particularly the ones that are not working for giant corporations. I know it's hard, at that level, but India and it's particularly indigenous creators and marginalized creators.
Mhm.
We should be even more bold sometimes. I think, and I really think that that's just definitely like a lot of your work that I've played represents that. But I mean, specifically on the minerals, I remember I follow closely what has happened over the last few years, like in Bolivia specifically.
Mhm.
And because the struggle like in Hawaii where we had thousands well, we had one of the biggest like decolonization kind of like Hawaiian sovereignty surges
Mhm.
here. You may have heard of like when during the Mauna Kea you know
Yeah, yeah. Was it a telescope? I think.
yeah, it's
Yeah.
you'd be like number 13 or 14 in a series of
Mhm.
many telescopes. And I have taught astronomy. I'm a STEM teacher as well. I taught
Yeah.
yeah to like under that's what neophyte is about, is being teaching to
Mhm.
under
Mhm.
resourced youth or some over resourced youth. Actually, I taught it for at the American Museum of Natural History like one summer, and but mostly I taught in the ghetto. We had no telescopes, but we had like a what 130-year-old microscope sometimes. But I did teach astronomy as well, so we're not, and the Hawaiians were never anti-science. We sail across
Mhm.
the ocean to tiny little plots of land across one third of the Earth's surface using star nav, advanced indigenous technology, which is
Mhm.
wayfinding using the stars, the ocean, the environment, the birds, etc. And so like so we're not anti-technology, but it was just these mega projects. Well, 600 astronomers signed I think that a document saying
Mhm.
that this is an obsolete telescope. We don't require it. Please stop, desecrating their sacred mountain. And also because of historical mismanagement of the other ones, one of the telescopes was never even used.
Right.
And so that altogether, and also it's kind of the same thing that you're kind of bringing up, which is that the
Mhm.
indigenous self-determination, right? It's kind of like it was imposed by a huge international conglomerate, the TMT Corporation, headed by one of the richest people on the face of planet Earth, Gordon Moore of Silicon Valley, co-founder of Intel, bringing it back to Cyberpunk,
Mhm.
Giant Silicon Valley, and
Yeah.
the Canadian government, which have been terrible to some of my family and friends up and comrades up there, Japan, India. It was an international huge project,
Mhm.
and the Hawaiians were left out of it, and a lot of what I saw happening in Bolivia with obviously the movement to socialism, Evo Morales,
Mhm.
the struggle against imperial, as you're saying, kind of international governments collaborating with often one government in particular, the one that is illegally occupying Hawaii, and
Yeah.
in order to extract resources from indigenous peoples who should have the ability to, uh, you know, um, you know, I mean, obviously, we don't want to be burning tons and tons of fossil fuel, particularly like if you're in a place where there's a lot of fossil fuel. But at the same time, the indigenous people should be able to determine, okay, well, we're going to use some of it now to get ourselves to a level of
Mhm.
development where we have roads, hospitals, education system, at least let us get up to where you are colonizers, and then we'll
Yeah.
look at how what else we could do. Also, Bolivia is sitting on a lot of lithium, and they had
Yeah.
the big
Absolutely.
stores. Yeah,
And I think that for a very long time, this is my experience like growing up in Paraguay, because Paraguay is like right beside Bolivia.
yeah.
Um, Generally speaking, like internationally, Bolivia and Paraguay, especially Bolivia, in like before Evo Morales ever was president there, like we're both seen as like very poor countries. And a lot of that is because of the fact that like we have a lot of natural resources and they're all extracted by, foreign corporations.
Mm,
And, those the ones who suffer the most are indigenous people. So like in the part of Bolivia specifically, for example, I forget the name of the town, but I remember seeing that there was a town in Bolivia where they were specifically given money, and this was during, I believe, Morales' presidency, but they were specifically given money to basically revitalize the town the way that the way they wanted to. And this resulted in the town being, turning very colorful because
mm,
they basically hired artists to paint all of the houses in the town and to paint all of the buildings so
right.
that by the end of the project you would see, from a distance, the town was like a really vibrant, like Andean painting,
Mm-hmm.
which is, an example of, when you give indigenous people the autonomy to do what they want, the result is something, very appropriate to like what they need, right? And at the same time, Bolivia also like because of the lithium and things like that that they have there. They have a lot of projects under Evo Morales to nationalize lithium and make like electric cars and make all these type of like electricity based transports that are environmentally friendly. And I think that's also like kind of like what my calling back to like my vision of indigenous futurism, that like what if indigenous people used a bunch of different minerals or lithium, and now they have like all these battery powered things to
Mm-hmm.
do their daily tasks with. They have like the cable cars, for example, now in Bolivia that are to go up the mountain and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I think that like all those types of like resource extraction just take us, keep us like fixed in this place where we're constantly struggling to, get anything at all. Um, and in particular, like so in my newest project that I'm developing, you basically play as three different characters, and each character is supposed to represent kind of like a different branch of cyberpunk or a different branch of indigenous futurism. So like one is like the Max, which is more of like more kind of sci-fi, not quite, but more kind of like technologically futuristic. And then there's another branch where you go into a town and it's more of like the rural cyberpunk that I had in like 1870, for example. And then there's a third branch where you play as like this old woman who she's like I forget what it's called, like a sharpshooter. So like that one is more of like a western, so it's kind of like a spin on like
Mm-hmm.
cyberpunk and a western, and like how do those blend together, and especially because of like the reputation of westerns and how anti-indigenous they can be. And I
Mm-hmm.
also wanted to play with that a little bit. And also because in Paraguay there's also to represent, like in Paraguay there's like a lot of different types of terrain, even in just that tiny area. We have the wetlands, we have the Amazon, we also have the very dry region, which is more familiar to like Bolivia, for example. So in that dry region is kind of like what a lot of struggles happen when it comes to farmers and peasants. And that's kind of like what the third branch is also based on, about the kind of agri-business struggle of, trying to keep out agribusiness corporations from exploiting the land.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and in the game, like they're armed and things like that. And that's kind of like reflecting the reality in South America, really, because in South America, the agribusiness is something very like brutal and very violent.
Mm-hmm.
It's very commonly associated with like almost like armed business, because if you in South America and Paraguay specifically, if you mess with, for example, a soy farmer, or if you want to go on their farm to, protest the fact that they have taken or stolen land, like they will hire people to kill you, basically.
Oh man.
So that's kind of like also what that background is, like the fact that like uh, all of these struggles, they're not just, it's not just like, oh, whoops, someone took this land. Like they did it by force, and they did it with, weapons. And that's, I think, what a lot of people forget when it comes to that, that each time that indigenous people, want to challenge colonization and want to, be autonomous, like there's a lot of violence on that other end. They can be different types of violence. It can be, quite literal, like with weapons, or it can be more uh, of an insidious type of violence where, people are separated, people are put into institutions in order to, take them away from their community.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's also what definitely like the project I'm working on tackles a lot of like um, things that are common throughout South America to indigenous people, but also just like in general, the concept of, being anti-imperialist and being anti-colonialist. And I always like, one of the reasons I'm really happy that Evo Morales is able to, travel around again normally and give speeches is that He gives us a lot of like really valuable knowledge, and one of them I remember was that like if you want to be a revolutionary, you have to be anti-imperialist. If you're
Mm.
not anti-imperialist, then like there's nothing revolutionary about anything you do, and like that's kind of like what I really strongly believe too, that like I am anti-imperialist in every sense of the word. That it's not just about thinking that colonization is bad. It's like every aspect of imperialism and colonialism is bad.
Yeah, yeah, I definitely remember that. I collected the clip of just that. You can't. It's not just about being a little bit progressive, or can I have $15 minimum wage and then maybe a little bit of healthcare, and then now I'm okay. No, it's like you have to be anti-imperialist, like in a international solidarity sort of way. And like I
Mhm.
definitely like resonate with that idea. And um, yeah, because it's a thing, particularly in a place like and it's just kind of like going back to what you're saying about how like if you are indigenous person, just say, please, can I have my land, the land that I was practicing my ways, collecting the herbs and food and or using for whatever. And that big corporation comes in and we're gonna farm here, or we're gonna drill here, or we're gonna
Mhm.
Exxon wants to come in and make a giant toxic dump here. In I think, was it Ecuador? That is one of the biggest environmental disasters
Mhm.
in the history of. I think it's the biggest environmental disaster, and then they just shoot you. And there's very little recourse. There's very little, international. What are they gonna do? And I remember like reading something from Evo that was who kind of began like in these fights against, as I understand it, against these huge corporations in these rural areas, in these in the where they're farming, or either oil company, agro company was coming in, and a lot of it was military. It was guerrilla, or
Mhm.
some amount of armed resistance against this military forces working for the corporations. And I will say, kind of like, we need we need a larger power base. We need a economic base, and we need a mass worker. We need worker unions plus all these environmental resistance, because we don't have any we can't wait and asking the West to please have some of your humanitarian, have the humanitarian
Mhm.
nonprofit that's next to the Exxon headquarters, please beg them to stop. That doesn't work. We have to like resist
Mhm.
with our own indigenous economic, cultural, armed, and what other military power that we have. And and I think like, just on that topic, I mean, that's what I often say is like, even in Hawaii, like we have a lot of problems for sure, but I'm like, thank God I'm not in Iraq, because I can wake up and I'm not worried about, is the blue sky gonna mean we're gonna get blown up today. They did bomb Mauna
Mhm.
Kea while
Mhm.
we were up there. They dropped 15,000 pounds of C4 equivalent bombs out of a B-52 Stratofortress on the mountain,
Mhm.
but which is itself a huge desecration of that mountain. It's all
Yeah.
radioactive over there. People got radiation sickness just protesting the bombing in Pohakuloa on our mountain, but they bombed it 6 miles from us, which is very scary. They flew Black Hawk helicopters over the elder tents of our kupuna, our elders who are up there. They flashed the lights, but they don't just come out and shoot everybody. So so we have that luxury. I think partially it's because we're too close to very wealthy white billionaire children. I mean, literally Jeff Bezos' children. I mean, I know some of these people, and it's too close. It's too much in the backyard, and so we have the luxury of that. But if you're in a lot of Central South American places, or if you're in a very dark alley in Chicago, you don't. And also in Honolulu as well. I worked in these places, and
Mhm.
people die regularly in the dark. When there's no cameras, or they can censor your camera off the internet for whatever reason.
Mhm.
But but that we do need to be. If you are in a place where you have some amount of access, some amount of luxury of like not having that, we need to like utilize that. I mean, this is more going to international political struggle, and struggle for
Mhm.
indigenous peoples. That's why I try to like talk about these people in the Middle East, Africa, South Central America, a little
Mhm.
bit, because I have the luxury of being able to say this stuff, and people are not going to come kick the door and like right now. Um, and so
Mhm.
anyway, this is back to kind of what you're saying, and I think that really this is really important. I think that the work that you're doing, representations of indigenous technology, indigenous futurisms. I mean, kind of Black Panther was kind of like a big splash in,
Hmm.
just, I mean, obviously, African, I believe the preferred term is African futurism, if I'm not mistaken.
Hmm.
That's what Nerio Okorafor, I believe, suggests. But I mean, who's working on the Shuri comics right now and also wrote some great books. But that kind of like Black Panther was a big like mass public. The world kind of saw like a possible future that was like not a Western white centered version of that
Hmm.
future, and kind of with the African people's art, architecture, culture, language, ways, practices, kind of, but also having very advanced technology, even more advanced than the United States and the rest of that world. And so like and so indigenous futurisms are really important. I'm thinking about the same thing, at the same time, like how can I represent, in the I'm working on Neofew 2, and I'm working on two other games, but how can I represent like indigenous a positive, because I do a lot of like Neofew is very cautionary, in the way that Cyberpunk is like, this is a terrible dystopian kind of world,
Hmm.
right? Because I think we also have to face that reality at the same time as we're trying to build the better non-colonized, non kind of destructive capitalist hell future. But then also like I'm like, how can I like infuse more positive visions to work towards? And I think that really comes down to like, yeah, it is just people using the technology and incorporating their technology in their practices. I mean, I had this idea for this kind of like the what comes after potentially what comes out a post United States, and it's like the
Hmm.
federated, partially automated indigenous socialist nations of the Anishinaabe that have this huge advanced city that is building high speed rail, like unlike the United States, which barely builds any. And then you have like the Haida, or the that
Hmm.
are doing they're making solar powered clipper ship, or the Hawaiians are making like solar powered clipper ships, and they kind of like refederate the kind of the collapsing systems of the settler colonial structure. And I was just
Hmm.
there's things I've been thinking of. I don't have anything that's super fleshed out. Although Silver Spoon Games, I will say this: Silver Spoon Games is like my attempt. We're a worker cooperative of myself and my partner there, and we plant kalo, we plant our historical Hawaiian staple foods in the front of our. Some pigs came and dug it up like a couple days ago, but that's also a struggle that Hawaiians have always dealt with, and so we're fencing that in with modern fencing, technology, and I'm using high speed internet. I program artificial intelligence, but also we can like be ecological and live sustainably with the land, and also like live in mutual respect with, like, in Hawaiian we call it aloha aina, is like the love of and care for the land. It means much more than that, and the land is
Hmm.
your mother. And with kuleana, our responsibility to each other, and so we can live like equitably to each other in our businesses, right, without one person or a handful of people making 99% and taking it, and then buying
Yeah.
off the entire government and then running off and blowing the world up with bombs. We can do that. We can do that by having equitable relationships with each other, with our children, and we also And anyway, now I'm just bragging, but but I think that all of that together is so important. And back to your stuff. Yeah, I mean, I'm really looking forward to this new work. I have not played. I'm sorry, what is it? Don't Wake the Night. I have to go back and check that out. I played 1870 like at least eight
Hmm.
times. So yeah.
Yeah, doing that is definitely very different from 1870 in that it kind of has like a similar dialogue approach where there's like a couple of branches, but it's definitely like very different in that it has no cyberpunk influences. And the funny thing is that I made 1870 while I was still developing Don't Wake the Night because I just had an idea and I wanted to just make it as like to take a break from developing that game and just make something shorter. And just making 1870 kind of made me realize that, okay, I definitely want my next project after Don't Wake the Night to be about cyberpunk or to be about, a futuristic world.
Mm.
So I think that it definitely kind of like planted the seed for that idea.
Mm-hmm.
And seeing people kind of react positively to it, it also, it also kind of like gives me more motivation to do it, just because I find that it's like a very specific subset or like subgenre of cyberpunk at times, or like even just futurism.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so it's something that I like have definitely like kind of it's kind of been bubbling up over the years, because technically the idea that I have for my current project, it first came to me like mm, probably like 2014. But it was nothing like what it is right now. Because back then I was, this was meant to be a comic initially, but then as I got more into game development, then I'm like, oh, I'll just make it a game. Because I also found that like the story that I originally had in 2014, like it dealt with a lot of different things, and I found that like, okay, if I'm gonna like load all of these themes and story into one single plot, then it's going to be very overbearing, in that like there's going to be a lot of things going on, and I don't know if I'm going to be able to kind of like stick that landing. So I
Mm-hmm.
decided to make it into a game, so then you can have the prospect of branching it up into different story paths or different choices. And initially, why I got the idea at first was because I was also thinking about like when I was first exposed to like cyberpunk, and the thing is like cyberpunk as a genre is like something very very kind of entrenched in pop culture. Like you'll probably come across cyberpunk one way or another without meaning to, but the first time that I kind of like willingly sought it out was probably when I read Akira when I was like
Mm-hmm.
when I was probably like six, no, 17. I think it was around 16 or 17 when I first read it, and I remember reading it in like a whole weekend. Like I just read it in one sitting, basically. Um, and that kind of like got me thinking about it. And the thing is, like, when you think about cyberpunk, Akira might not be like the first thing that comes to mind, but to me, it's kind of like my first exposure to like, okay, this takes place in the future. Everything's kind of shitty. Also, there's like, people with, advanced abilities, like in this case, like psychic, but also there's, more technological stuff going on underneath the surface.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that kind of like it got the gears turning a little bit for me narratively, because like Akira is definitely like one of my favorite stories that I've ever read, just because I feel that it's kind of like what you mentioned about cyberpunk being very political, and that for those who have read read Akira, not just watch the movie, Akira is a very political series. It's not just about like, oh, this one character has like special powers. It's also a lot about, government, the government controlling, young people rebelling, all these kind of things, especially with like the series explicitly being released, in the 80s and referencing a lot of, post-war Japan in its narrative.
Mm-hmm.
I think that like it's something very political that, sometimes people are surprised when they go from watching the movie to reading the comics. They're kind of like surprised that, oh, actually like the plot goes a lot deeper than it does in the movie, because obviously like the comic is very long, right? So it wasn't able to all fit in the movie. And when you go actually read it, it's like, oh, it goes much deeper, and it kind of, goes deeper into questioning, the government, questioning authority and all those things. So it got me like, it was definitely kind of like my foray into like, what makes cyberpunk political, and, how can that be expressed?
Yeah, I confess I have not read the whole comic. I'll have to go back and check it out. I've seen the movie, and obviously, yeah, Ghost in the Shell was one of my earlier
Mhm. Yeah, that one too. I
exposures.
remember watching the movie. I think I like read Akira, and then I watched Ghost in the Shell right
Hmm.
after.
Yeah. That was one of the definitely one of the earlier ones. Speaking of that, if anybody has any questions, because we are probably going to be, I think you have to go fairly shortly, so quickly ask your question and maybe we'll get it answered. Um, yeah, because you have to go, I believe, in a few minutes, right?
Yeah, a couple of minutes. I can stick around for like 10 more minutes.
Okay. Yeah, I think we've covered a lot of good ground. There's a lot of directions to take this, but I think that let's see. So yeah, so I guess like if if you could, like, I don't know, this is kind of a question that people ask a lot. It's probably not the best one, but you know, if you had like as much assets, you let's say you have like all of CD Projekt Red's assets at your dollars resources at your disposal, you can make absolutely anything you want to make. What would you do? Like you get like, I don't know, all the billions, right? What would you make?
Yeah, because I think, and I might be off by a few numbers, but I think Cyberpunk's 2077's budget was like over 300 million US.
Yeah.
Um, I think it was like, yeah, 318 or something. But if I had that much money, I mean, first of all, like I feel like I'm such in a financial position that even if someone gave me like $100,000 to make a video game, I'm like, wow, that's a lot of money. Um, but I think like with that much money, I don't know. I think I would immediately just like um I feel like I wouldn't know what to do with all that money. Because it's such like an inordinate amount of money to make a game. I guess like what I would do is like I would just make a game and also make like I don't know, make a bunch of make this like a long kind of long-term project where I can iterate on different forms of indigenous cyberpunk and um, like for example, like I have an animation background, right? And animation can be quite expensive.
Mm.
Like for me would be I would even, maybe step outside of games and like, I don't know, make an anime based on indigenous cyberpunk. um, or like and make, more forms of media just that are outside of games. But I
Mm.
mean, even with all that money, I would probably just like make sure like I can found like a co-op that is like pays everyone equally, everyone has benefits. With that kind of money and my kind of scope, like no one would we would maybe have to work like, I don't know, 3 days a week or something like that, or 2 days a
Mm.
week. And like we would just like I don't know, like like that concept of money is like so foreign to me that it kind of like blows my mind that a studio can have that much money for a project when even just for my own games, like it's hard to even get $10,000 to make a video game.
Mm.
Um, and even then, even with like that small amount of money, I still make sure that everyone gets, the pay that they deserve. Um, and I find that a very common with like people that have smaller budgets tend to be more fair about the pay that they're giving rather than when you get these overblown budgets, then that's when people start hoarding money and start to capitalism happens and they start to not actually share the resources equally. um,
Mm.
yeah, I think with that much money I would probably like, first of all, I'd probably give away a bunch of it and then actually take what I actually need.
Yeah, yeah. You know, that's like I was just talking to my friend. Cause I'm working on a couple projects. Like one of my friends is working on. It's more like Cyberpunk 2077. It's not. It's what's nowhere near the scale. It's like 6 people. It's a Deus Ex. I don't know if you heard of that game, Deus Ex.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, so it's kind of like a Deus Ex. I made a total conversion called Terminus Machina, which is like my own take. It's like my Silver Spook version of Deus Ex, and we're working on like a sequel. That's like a bigger team than mine. Neo 2 is just me. I do the writing, art, I do everything basically on that. But it's 2D point and click adventure game style. So, but the other
Mhm.
one is a bigger one. 6 people. It's like a 3D RPG. It's interactive. You can fight. You can stealth. You can like a Deus Ex, Fallout, Cyberpunk 2077. It's a immersive sim sort of game. And we're talking. It was like, what if we were to sell like, I don't know, million, 2 million. I mean, what are we gonna do with the money, right? Or I have not made anywhere
Mhm.
close to. I have not even made, like, if I was paid full time, it would be like 90,000 to 150,000, and I have not made anywhere near that for my own game, Neofeud
Mhm.
on Steam and itch. But I was like, what if for some what if like Jim Sterling and the biggest streamer and Markiplier all play Neofeud on their stream and I get $1 million? I'm like, what am I gonna do with that? I had that thought. And I'm like, obviously that's like, hopefully, but it isn't. I figured, I was like thinking, I was like, this is important because like, yeah, as you're saying, kind of like a small team, one person, two, three, 4 people, you can kind of keep it pretty. I call it aloha that's what Olo means. You can keep it very, or another word, the more modern, the younger culture, they call it socialism, or worker cooperative, but it means just kind of
Hmm.
like equitably distributing, the production and the resources, so nobody's getting like just disproportionately too much and
Yeah.
controlling everybody else, right? It's kind of, you can keep that kind of like, on the indie teams pretty. You can it's not sometimes they go wrong, but you can keep it more equitable and worker cooperative style in that small scale. But how do you scale up? And I
Mhm.
was talking to, like, how do we if we were to scale up, we're going to go 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. At what, and I was like, and from what I noticed, because I've worked at big corporations, I've worked at government, nonprofit, you name it, and when it gets to a certain scale, Wall Street or those kind of people show up. They want the investors that throwing money at, and they find somebody. It's the same way that, that's how they get their fingers into Hawaii. They go, which Hawaiian wants to take $600,000 to say okay to this gentrification, right? Who,
Mhm.
and so that's where it does become a tricky. Like, even electronic arts itself started out as like
Mhm.
bringing fine art. Yeah, now it's EA, but it started out as just bringing fine art and avant-garde art to games, and then it grew and it grew, and then somewhere, right, the kind of capitalism found a little crowbar crack to shove itself in, and then start
Mhm.
prying
Mhm.
open and going, okay, who wants to make a lot of money? Okay, sell out all your partners,
Mhm.
right? And
Yeah.
so, anyway, so that's a thing I think about often, but it is important. I mean, but there are examples, like Mondragon is 80 times the size of 80,000 people. Mondragon is the biggest
Mhm.
cooperative on the face of the earth in Spain. It's the seventh biggest entity in Spain, and they have 80,000 people, and they're 80 times bigger than CD Projekt. 1,100 employees at CD Projekt. Mondragon 80,000. So it's not impossible, but it does require a lot of like education, cultural, a lot of things binding, and it's a lot of organization binding things kind of together, and kind of
Mhm.
like creating like a kind of like a antibodies, a kind of immune system against kind of capitalist incursions, or attacks.
Yeah.
And anyway, that's this
Yeah.
is theoretical, but yeah.
Yeah. Like for me personally, like I'm at a point where like hopefully, because yeah, I've mostly used to working by myself and then working with like other friends or other colleagues that are with me, and I'm like, okay, hey, I can pay you this much for this much work, and a lot of the work that is done, is done on kind of like an honorarium basis
Mm-hmm.
when budget's really tight. And I think that like if, and I'm kind of on the path to hopefully establish some kind of official, more of an official studio structure where I can actually say, hey, this is how we share labor with each other, so that way no one person can do what is something that is sufficient for them.
Mm.
And I think that I sometimes joke about this with some of my friends, but I tell them, if it ever gets to the point where like we just make a bunch of money and we're hoarding it, just like shoot me. Just like you're allowed to just go up and shoot me, and if you do, like I'll kind of know what I did wrong.
I'd say, I'm not even joking. That's exactly what I tell people. And I told that guy, I said, if you see Silver Spoon Games and you see me like in a yacht or two, you cancel Silver Spoon. I said, I give you permission. Bring the guillotine out.
Yeah,
We don't need. I'm a fake
yeah,
Silver Spook.
like
They injected their cyberware in my brain.
yeah, it's like by that point, it's like I've kind of gone against everything that I believe in.
Exactly. Before we go, I gotta get this. Somebody asked this question, so I do want to bring this up. Are there any resources? MSN asks. MSN is also an indigenous friend, and does a lot of great work. Are there any resources, websites, social media profiles that y'all really like to look that you like to look to for other folks representing indigenous futurism?
That's a good question. I think, well, there is a website now up for like indigenous game dev. I can't remember. I think it's called indigenousgamedev.com. That's usually where Elizabeth Lepensick curates a lot of indigenous game development content, and as well as like somewhat related to indigenous futurisms.
Mm-hmm.
The other one I think is like I generally really like to just follow like different indigenous film festivals. Like I was recently involved with, how I mentioned Imaginative. And
Yeah.
I helped curate an arcade of like futuristic, indigenous games or indigenous games that deal with, the politics of resistance. And those are all up that I think I recently shared it on my Twitter, but Imaginative Film Festival is generally a great place where like filmmakers or interactive media is showcased, and a lot of it can be doesn't it's maybe not explicitly about indigenous futurisms, but I think it's adjacent to it. Um, and I also just really enjoy, yeah, I enjoy following like individual creators. Um, yeah, but those are the kind of like two major websites that I can think of when I think of indigenous futurisms. And there might be, I believe there is might be something on Facebook as well for indigenous futurisms. But yeah, I would definitely check those two websites out for more like indigenous futurism content.
Okay, yeah, great. I think that's what I would say. You I think you probably know where to go. There's also, if you are an indigenous creator, Elizabeth Laponce has also created and a variety of indigenous creators have a Discord. Uh,
Mhm.
indigenous, I believe you're in that. The
I'm not like the most, I'm not super active on Discord groups, but I think, yeah, there isn't also an indigenous game dev a Discord group.
Yeah, indigenous game devs. I'm in that as well. And
Mm.
if you want well, you can tweet at or contact Elizabeth or myself, and yeah, there's a lot of indigenous creators, and we try to support each other in our and it's a very supportive community. I mean, if you know anything about indigenous peoples, we definitely do our best to try to help uplift each other, as is that's we're not all the
Mhm.
same, but we definitely, they're like I said, Kuliana and Pono, and it's communal, collective support is definitely
Mm.
like a deep value for us. So if you are an indigenous creator and you're watching this, do be sure to ask one or both of us about that if you want more information on that. Oh yeah, and Megan Byrne, also do check out Megan Byrne. I
Mhm.
might try to talk to Megan in the near. I've talked to Megan on one of these streams back in the day.
Mhm.
Oh, also, yeah, Solomon, yeah, Holly, my partner, is dropping all the links. Also, Alan Turner is another indigenous creator
Oh yes, yeah, yeah, yeah.
that is kind of like has been a veteran of the game industry for a while, and Council of Fools. Yeah, we've got, look at that. We've got exclamation mark Nightbot commands for all of these people. That's great. Anyways, yeah. But yeah. So it's 11:09 here. So we probably should be calling it. But this is it's been really amazing talking. I've been a fan of this stuff for a long time, so I'm very sorry. We were planning to have a little chat a couple years ago. Didn't quite happen, but better late than never,
Yeah,
because
it
yeah.
happened. It still happened at kind of like an appropriate time, right?
Oh yeah, I mean, this is the best time. I mean, when the Cyberpunk
Yeah.
is the right after Cyberpunk 2077 release, the best time for sure.
Mhm.
Anything else you want to like uh, add about yourself, or anything else where you can find you?
Um, yeah, you can just find me on Twitter at Babbygoth, so Babbygoth. That's usually where I post about all my work. Um, Recently, just sharing like some updates, mostly to my Patreon now. So I also have a Patreon under the same username, and that's where I upload weekly updates on the current project I'm working on. So I share, programming things that I'm doing. I share art there as well. So yeah, definitely check it out and give a follow if you want to stay updated on what I'm doing right now.
Awesome. And yeah, you should know me. If you don't, I'm Silver Spook. And you can find me on Twitter. Just type Silver Spook, and Neophyte is the game, obviously. But I'm not need to sell it right now. But do check it out. Everything we do is supported by sales of that game, and you can also support us on Patreon as well. Um, Anyways, yeah, thanks everybody for checking this out, watching this stream and listening. And I learned as much as I think. Oh yeah, and also check out Joey. Uh, Duende is the, the best indigenous tweeter I've ever met. But anyways, okay. Take it easy, everybody. Okay, I'm gonna stop.